Who dreads to the dead returning? Who shrinks from that sable shore, where the high and haughty yearning of the souls will
The bloody conflict between Boer and Britain had now been waged for some 7 months. The Boer Free State government, with President Kruger of the Transvaal state present, had been driven out of Bloemfontein and was now in the town of Kroonstad, about 100 miles northeastward. And there they debated what could be done in their struggle for freedom. The formal battles against overwhelming British odds could no longer be fought. Mr. Domercer explained the lethal dilemmas.
To take up a defense position with against an army of 60,000 men was regarded as useless. So really, to my mind, I think that from that time, the guerrilla war was started at that date at Kroonstad.
They didn't face up to it. They were drilled away, you know, always on their own. That was our trouble, we couldn't keep up with them.
Of course, it was a bit clever of them to keep out of the way of your bullets.
They hadn't the strength.
So the great guerrilla war began. There were spectacular Boer victories and British victories, but overall, Lord Roberts's war machine drove northwards towards Johannesburg and, above everything else, towards the gold mines. Kimberley and Cecil Rhodes and his diamonds were duly relieved, and on May the 16th, 1900, the British reached besieged Mafeking. England went embarrassingly wild with relieved delight. By June the 5th, 1900, the British Army entered Pretoria, the capital city of the South African Republic, the Transvaal. President Kruger and his government fled eastward on this presidential train towards the only exit, the Portuguese colony of Lorenzo Marques, where the young Queen of Holland, Wilhelmina, had heroically provided him with a warship to enable him to escape to Europe. It was the lowest ebb for the Boers so far. Lord Roberts and many other Britishers believed that the war was virtually over with the capture of Pretoria. They felt that it was now a simple matter of rounding up these surviving Boers. That belief proved to be a gigantic mistake. Field Marshal Lord Roberts is often thought of as a gentleman, but when he realized that the Boers were far from finished, he began to introduce a brutal, scorched earth policy. Destroy the farms and burn down the farmhouses. The British ignored the Hague Convention on laws and customs of war, and we exercised a monstrous regime. We constructed all over southern Africa what we unfortunately call concentration camps, and we drove many thousands of women and children into them. Eventually, Lord Roberts retired to England, and Lord Kitchener took over his command, and the brutality increased. Of course, not every British soldier sympathized with his country's ruthless determination to crush the Boer people.
help to do it.
What was that like?
Oh, horrible, horrible, heartbreaking to us as youths. It wasn't right at all, but you had to do it.
Why did you have to do it?
Orders. Orders.
The world looked at us British and despised us. Not untinged with envy, I am sorry to add, because we British were going to take the gold away from the Boers and not them. We British stood naked before the world and were overwhelmingly unashamed. The Boers had great moral heroes, and we had none. But that awful contrast was about to change. Of course, we British suppressed the truth about what was happening to the Boer women and children of South Africa, but rumors were floating around, and they reached the consciousness of a maiden lady who lived in Cornwall. Her name was Emily Hobhouse. Initially, she founded an organization which she called the South African Women and Children's Distress Fund, and through it she raised £300, and on December the 7th, 1900, she sailed from England for Cape Town. She paid her own fare, and she was not wealthy. She travelled alone. The Hobhouse family were not without influence, and she arrived here in Cape Town with several letters of introduction to Alfred Milner, the British High Commissioner. Miss Hobhouse was determined to know what was happening to the Boer women and children, and to help them, if help was needed. Sir Alfred, I want to visit the concentration camps. Oh. I have £300 worth of supplies, comforts, for the Boer women and children. That, Miss Hobhouse, might prove to be a little difficult. The military are in charge. Oh, well, with all due respect, Sir Alfred, the welfare of all refugees, so I gather from Whitehall, is your ultimate responsibility. And public opinion in Britain and elsewhere is getting uneasy. My visiting with my gifts might help pacify the situation. Sir Alfred Milner uneasily provided Emily with a letter of authorization to visit one large camp at Bloemfontein. Perhaps Emily Hobhouse saw herself as a Lady Bountiful, a do-gooder, as they call it these days. But when she entered this British concentration camp, she was confronted by hell on earth. Death and appalling suffering were all around her. Emily calmly stated, I call this camp system wholesale cruelty. It can never be wiped out from the memories of the people. It presses hardest on the children. There are two courses open to me: to stay among the people, doling out small gifts of clothes, or to return home with the hope of inducing both the British government and the British public to give help so that at least the Boer children might be saved.
What I heard from my parents, as they naturally knew her, They regarded her as a holy angel. So good was she to the people. She was a well-doer. They regarded her as an angel out of heaven. The people who died in the camps, I cannot say for sure because those days I was a child, but I know that the women and children died like flies. What the English did to them, I cannot say. I don't want to say things of which I know nothing, but I just know the death rate was terrible.
Maar ik weet net, die sterfgevallen was vreselijk.
But many people died, many. I had 3 sisters and 2 mothers that died. 1 stepmother and my own mother that died in the camps.
Emily returned to Britain and began to create an international storm against the policies of British imperialism, and her outrage was ever supported by the Welshman, David Lloyd George. He said, the Herod of old sought to crush a little race by killing all the young children. It was not a success, and I would commend that story to Herod's modern imitators. Boer commandos were attacking the vast British army wherever and whenever they could. A favourite target was the railway lines, which stretched across the far-flung territories. Mr. Prinsloo was one of the train raiders.
Look, all of us, we lay and waited there, you see. And when the train came, the shell hit it. The engine turned over and we all stormed the train.
Yeah.
The engine in front and the trucks behind were on fire.
Yeah.
The train was on its side, and there were a few women who got hurt. 2 of them were killed. And with the overturning of the train, a few soldiers were also killed. But we didn't stop to look at that. We just looted what food and clothes we could get. And I got this army coat. A friend got a jacket and trousers, another a blanket. There were about 20 of us, and we all grabbed what we could. We really looted the whole train.
And you wore it for the rest of the war, did you?
Het wordt het gedragen gedurende de rest van de oorlog.
No, when my father heard what had happened, he wouldn't let me wear it, because he said if the British caught us wearing their clothes, we would be shot dead. He told me to burn it. So I went and buried it in a tin drum, and when peace came, I went and got it out. And this is the coat.
And as we have learnt, the British looted in a very big way, but sometimes relatively innocently, Mr. Saunderson of the Northumberland Yeomanry.
We were coming along past Cronge's house one day when I was in Vaux's machine runs.
Whereabouts was that in South Africa?
I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you where it was, exactly where it was. I couldn't tell you. But only Vaux detailed me to go. He said, go and look after their house until the niggers get all past, because it mustn't be looted. 2 of us went to look after the house. When the convoy got past, everything got past, I said, we're going to have a look inside, see what there is. And when we got inside, there was this claret jug.
What, that one on the table?
That claret jug on the table. And, of course, I just strapped it onto my wallet and came away with it as a souvenir. That's what it was.
And that came out of this?
Cronge's house.
You took that from General Cronge's house?
That's right.
How did you get it back to England?
Well, luckily, I had a skin rug. And I filled it first of all with ostrich feathers for Mother. And then I had a skin rug, and I wrapped it in the skin rug and tied it up in the Morpeth Herald.
Which had been sent out to you from?
It had been sent to me from Morpeth, and it got home safely. There you are.
Well. You mean you sent that through the post?
All the way from the veldt.
General Cronge's I hope no relatives of General Cronje are going to see this film. They might want it back, you know.
Well, you never know.
They'll have to come and get it.
You'll have to come and see it.
Lord Kitchener was again forced to realize that he couldn't defeat the Boers in any conventional military sense, even with his scorched earth policy. So he and his imperial chums hit upon a new idea: build many hundreds of small forts called blockhouses, crisscrossing the great territories with thousands of miles of barbed wire, and in this method drive the many Boer commanders at them and thereby trap them. Kitchener's imperial army combed and combed the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, attempting to drive the Boers onto the British blockhouses and onto the British barbed wire. Our Mr. Saunderson spoke about one of those multiple drives.
Now, Lord Bethune was driving the Boers onto us with our wagons. They were coming galloping along, and his pom-pom shells had just coming in behind them. When we got the order to independent firing with magazines, and as soon as we opened fire, the Boers tossed their hands up like that and surrendered. We rushed out to pick up the rifles, and one or two of them, seeing there were so few of us, began jumping on the horses and galloping away. And Tommy Cairns, the brigade, was standing next to me, and he shot one getting into the saddle and rolled him onto his back. Tommy Cairns went forward. The first thing you do with a dead boy is to feel what he's got in his pocket. Cougar pennies was worth £1 because there was some gold in a cougar penny. So to said, Tommy Cairns put his hand in the Boer's pocket, and the Boer opened his eyes. He said, "Oh, I beg your pardon, I thought you were dead," says Tommy Cairns. He didn't like everybody was looking at him.
The Boers didn't make any great attack on foot. But the way our forces were scattered in the hills, they were picked up piecemeal until eventually we were all captured. A particular incident concerning myself was when I got up from my position, which I occupied overnight. Everything seemed quiet, and I got up to see what was going on. And there I found myself being covered by a Boer, actually aiming at me. I couldn't do anything. And the other man that I saw there was at the time, he had to put his rifle down. From there,
May I ask one question? Have you ever thought to yourself why that Boer didn't pull the trigger and kill you?
Well, I should say he was a very humane man. Evidently had no hatred in us as a Britisher. Therefore he didn't pull the trigger. I can't think of any other reason.
I felt a bit tired and I laid down my back against the pole after I finished it and went to sleep. Next thing I knew, I felt something poking me ribs. So I looked up, there was 3 Boers looking at me. So one of the fellows could speak English quite well. He says, "Where's your gun?" I said, "I forgot it." "It's a good job for you." He says, "We don't shoot unarmed men." I thought, that's all right. I was only a boy, mind you. And he said, "All right, take your clothes off." So I looked at him, "What for?" He said, "Take your clothes off. We want them." He says, "Don't we look like it?" They was all in rags, you know. They'd store up round their feet for boots. So I had to strip, of course, and he took every damn thing from me. I was in my birthday suit. He said, "Now you go and join your mates." I says, "Like this." So one of them threw me a sack. He'd been using it as a coat. So I put it on, but I soon took it off. Because it had more resonance than I wanted to be. Oh, it's full of lice.
For 15 months of wickedly cruel warfare, the name of the Boer military leader, Christian de Wet, had grown and grown. He became a hero even around the world, even amongst the British soldiers fighting him in South Africa, even in Britain itself. The farmer, Christian de Wet, defeated the soldiers of the British Empire again and again. With him, most of the time, was his president, President Steyn of the Orange Free State. It was a government on the gallop. By October the 30th, 1901, the Boers fought a famous and terrible battle at a place called Bakenlaagte, which is in the eastern Transvaal. Mr. Domisser was present.
General Botha was very annoyed with Colonel Benson because he treated a woman and children in a very bad manner. General Botha decided to attack his force, but he could not gather more than at the outside figure 500 men. Some of the men went into that battle with only 10 or 15 rounds. And they attacked the center of Benson's front. Benson was wounded, died afterwards there. He couldn't save his guns. So that is a battle there. 500 men attacking a very strong armed column of 3,000 men. And that showed a great amount of courage on the Boer part, because we must remember there were no doctors, no ambulances. When you were wounded, you were left at the mercy of the enemy, and attacking with only a round of 10 bullets, no bandolier. That, I think, showed a great amount of confidence and courage.
Yes, Mr. Domisser was right. The Boers did demonstrate confidence and courage. In that battle called Bakenlaagte, they killed or wounded 161 British soldiers out of 178 in one section alone. Nevertheless, the Boers still wouldn't surrender to the armies of our British Empire. Mr. Van Wyk, Boer officer, was present at one of the very last battles of the sprawling guerrilla war.
The cavalry didn't do anything. We just went right through them.
Were you shooting from the saddle?
Yes, and they were shooting.
From the saddle, you were
From
shooting?
the saddle, yes. From the saddle, we were. We came to the line where the British were. We just went right through them. They had their bayonets. They were just stabbing one ear. I did the same. I have had my rifle. I just did that and loaded and pulled off.
By February 1902, General Lord Kitchener was dangerously frustrated, and he organized an astonishingly detailed trap in order to destroy General de Wet. Finally, British intelligence informed Kitchener that de Wet and 1,800 fighting burghers were in an area of the Western Orange Free State. Kitchener placed 9,000 British soldiers in a straight line which stretched for 54 miles. The incredible line advanced westward at the rate of 20 miles per day. Behind de Wet was the central railway line with its blockhouses and barbed wire, which was additionally lined with another 8,000 British soldiers. And for full measure, there were 7 armoured trains constantly patrolling along the central railway line. De Wet, realizing the massive military weight which was organized to crush him, suddenly swung south with only 600 of his men and crashed through the southern line of blockhouses and barbed wire into his homeland. leaving a raging kitchen far, far behind. And that was Christian de Wet. The Anglo Boer War was now bitter attrition. Of course, the British casualties, wounded or dead, were reasonably looked after. But the social class arrangements of imperialism were ever present. Mr. Moyer went on remembering the truth, an often embarrassing quality in this human life.
There was a temporary hospital put up, and our losses, our killed and wounded were put in this, and those who lost their lives, unfortunately, they were sewn up in a blanket, which charged against their account by the government.
They were charged?
Yes, a man had to pay, yes. Out of, when he got his settling up money, the price of the blanket was deducted from any credit due to him.
That doesn't speak too well for England, does it?
That happened out there.
I believe that when an officer was buried, they did put a Union Jack over him. That was the difference.
Well, there's no Union Jack put over the Tommies.
As insensitive as the British were to even their own soldiers, they were far better off than the Boers were. Mr. Domisser had something to say on that subject.
Now I must say this, that in spite of the Geneva Convention, the Red Cross Geneva Convention, the English took away all our ambulances and all our doctors, which was contrary to the terms of the Geneva Convention, for which they were a member, so we were members.
Who do you think was guilty of that sort of behavior?
I think it's the Commander-in-Chief. I think it was Kitchener.
But now the fighting Boers were inevitably at the end of their tether. Their farming land and cattle, etc., were destroyed, and most awful of all, some 26,000 of their women and children, and remember, out of a small total population, were dead in the British concentration camps. These thousands of still fighting Boers, the Afrikaners of today, were known as the bitter enders. They often wore sacking and rags. Long before, their famous Mauser rifles were of no use. No more Mauser ammunition was available. They now used captured British rifles and ammunition, often manufactured by Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain's family at Birmingham in England. Finally, the proud Afrikaner people were compelled to sue for peace. Their numerically small nation was faced with virtual genocide at the hands of the British. And not only the British, black Africans were beginning to go on a murderous rampage. Isolated and unprotected Boer women and children were savagely butchered. The Boer military leaders met at Vereeniging to discuss the terrible reality. The gathering was reminded by its leaders that they still had 22,000 burghers in the field, poised to continue the war. General Louis Botha suggested that the Boers might offer to give to the English the gold fields of their country in exchange for peace and independence. Louis Botha was a perceptive man, and he knew exactly what the British enemy wanted. But now, with the wide world watching closely, gold was not enough. Total victory for the British was now an imperative. Finally, Coustelare, now known as the Lion of the West, stood up, and he spoke the unadorned truth.
It is no longer a question of fighting to the bitter end. This is the bitter end.
Mr. Hall, of the Royal Engineers, saw General Botha and his Boer delegation arrive to discuss peace.
We saw the party coming over there. Oh, maybe about 150 yards or so. In fact, he gave us a salam. He walked past us, they walked past us.
He was a fine soldier, wasn't he?
He was a real man. Yes, yes.
The final tussle between the Boer and the British took place here, in this very building, Melrose House, in Pretoria. Alfred Milner, the British High Commissioner, was at his cold, merciless worst. And beside him, Lord Kitchener appeared to be a relative humanitarian. And also present was the awful spirit of Joseph Chamberlain, the ultimate puppet master of Britain's empire. The Boers signed the surrender document, and their proud independence was destroyed in this room.
What did you think of the peace terms?
I think it's fair.
You Boers have a lot of charity in you.
Well, what can we do? People were looking on us, not people, but all the big powers of the world were looking at us like that to grab, you see.
The gold.
The gold.
For the Boer soldiers, the pain of their surrender to the British invaders never left them even to the end of their often long days. However, the saga of their nearly 3 years of fighting resistance was not forgotten either. Mr. Domicer, Domicer, remembered his own particular capitulation.
About 600 men gathered there, and General Botha came riding up. That was about on the 5th of June. He told us all about peace, terms of peace and so on. They had to surrender arms. Officers could retain their rifles and so on. So they come on the road into Heidelberg and threw away their arms. But most of the men there said, surrender my rifle. Never. So they smashed them to pieces with rocks, threw them away.
And then Mr. Domicer asked a significant and rhetorical question about why patriots can eventually defeat even a vast army of foreign occupation.
How was it possible that 20,000 Boers, without sufficient ammunition, supplies of clothing, guns, or doctors or ambulances, anything like that, could hold back the British army of 500,000 men? How is it? How do you declare it? How is it possible? That's a question which needs answering, eh? Well, but I'm not going to give you that answer now.
I am not a my country right or wrong man. Many, many years ago, when I was filming our old veterans of the Anglo Boer War, I put it this way.
Of course, over this question of morals and ethics, we British generally believed ourselves to be in the right. Whatever they did and however they did it, they had to make it look like a decent game of cricket. Indeed, strangest of all, they seemed to believe that it was a decent game of cricket. Oh, we haven't changed much, have we?
But we don't learn the iron answer, do we? British soldiers and British police and British God knows what else will always be fought against as long as we still occupy any part of, say, the Irish people's island. I am sure that the spirit of Mr. Domicer agrees with me.
In those days, Mr. Saunderson, do you remember feeling proud of Queen Victoria and the British Empire?
Oh, always. Always. Yes. Always. I think that, you see, there was some got 2 medals for the Boer War. And I'm always pleased that mine is the Queen's Medal. You see, there was a King's Medal as well for the Boer War. Some of them got 2, but I've only got the one, the Queen's Medal. Because the war was fought during the Queen's time. Oh, yes. I think we've been a very fortunate country to have our monarchs carry on the way they've carried on.
The bloody war had been fought, and inevitably the British Empire had won at a ghastly cost in human suffering, and all for British material profit. I asked Colonel Lang if there had not been another way for us British to behave.
What was the alternative? I think in those days, you know, we were colonizing people. We owned half Africa. You look at the old maps. Yeah, the Union Jack was everywhere. We had the biggest fleet in the world. We owned it. Look at India. Look at India. We owned India. But we owned it all up. In those days, we had a different idea of the whole thing. We were Lord God Almighty, weren't we?
The Anglo Boer War was the beginning of the end of the British Empire. Mr. Domicer was left with one bitter regret. He believed, and with considerable evidence to support his faith, that the Boers could have hastened his passionate wish for the final demise of England's imperial power.
It's only afterwards that I learned more about warfare and so on, that I could see the mistakes, the very great mistakes, which were made right from the outset of the war. As a matter of fact, one can almost say the war was lost at the Battle of Dundee. The war was lost at the Battle of Colenso. The war was lost at the Battle of Smolensk. Looking back, because we did not make a desperate effort to once and for all destroy the enemy once they were defeated. Too much Christianity and too much democracy was the causes which lost the war to the Boer forces.
Going back to the burnt and shattered farms, emotions, of course, varied. I asked Mr. Prinsloo if he felt bitter towards the British.
No, at the end of the war, when I came back here, I was the first to arrive on our farm. I had a feeling of futility. Why did it have to happen? A feeling of despair. A feeling of inferiority. I felt, why couldn't God have ordained things better?
I asked Mr. Van Wyk if his return home was a happy time.
Well, we were a happy family, that was certainly. But things have changed
all together. It was a family farm. It wasn't burned down, but there were no windows and there were no doors. Why? I don't know. They've just made fire on.
Do you remember when you arrived home what your mother said to you?
Oh, to school.
I innocently asked Mrs. Domercer if she could imagine her husband fighting the British here as a young man. Her reply was more than I had bargained for, and for me it is unforgettable, even though it is tinged with irony in the year 1999.
The war, this English war in South Africa, was the stupidest war the English ever waged, for this reason. All that they achieved was the consolidation of the Afrikaner people, right from the tip of the Cape to furthest boundary of Transvaal. It gave, afterwards, it gave to the world a new nation, the Afrikaner nation, and a new language, the Afrikaner language. And that language and that nation is to the English die-hard a thorn in their flesh, just as our die-hards a thorn in our flesh. For the rest, we work together and we live in peace. And we work together for the good of this beautiful land of ours.
I did say earlier in this film that there would be more about our only true British hero during those 3 long years of British imperial criminality, Miss Emily Hobhouse. Here in Bloemfontein, in the old Orange Free State, the Boers constructed this great memorial in memory of the 26,000, mainly Boer women and children, who died in our British custody. Miss Hobhouse made a statement.
As your tribute to the dead, bury unforgiveness and bitterness at the foot of our monument forever. Instead, forgive, for you can afford it. Forgive the rich who are greedy of more riches. Forgive the statesman who could not guide affairs. Forgive the bad generalship that made war on weaklings and babes. Forgive, for so only can you rise to your full nobility of character. And a broad, noble, national life.
At the foot of this memorial, the Afrikaner people of the Orange Free State buried their great president, Martin Steyn, and the great fighting general Christian de Wet. On June the 8th, 1926, Emily Hobhouse died, and at her request, the Boers, the Afrikaner people of today, brought her remains down the South Atlantic Ocean and then here to Bloemfontein, where she joined the national heroes. A vast concourse of people attended the ceremony. The Afrikaner people mourned. The statesman, Jan Smuts, spoke the oration. We stood alone in the world, friendless among the people. The smallest nation ranged against the mightiest empire on the earth. And then, one small hand, the hand of a woman, was stretched out to us. At that darkest hour, when our race almost appeared to be doomed to extinction, she appeared as an angel, a heaven-sent messenger. And strangest of all, she was an English woman. Well, Jan Smuts was not correct in describing her thus. Once upon a time, he had remarked that she belonged to the conquering race. Emily swung on him and corrected. She said, "I am a Celt, and my ancestors were driven westward to Cornwall by the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Normans. That is, Mr. Smuts, by the English." Oh, and incidentally, that Second Anglo Boer War, I repeat, was the beginning of the end of the British Empire.
Who dreads to the dead returning? Who shrinks from that sable shore, where the high and haughty yearning of the souls will be known? Time was when we frowned on others. We thought we were wiser then. But now let us all be brothers, for we never may meet again. So stand to your glasses steady, 'tis all we have left to prize. Quaff a cup to the dead already, and one to the next who dies.